under the present law, you require 100% of the owners of a building to agree before you can demolish an old building. Obviously, to have 100% agreement, I think is a practical impossibility, which is why in Hong Kong, depending on the age of the building, you might require only 80% approval or 90% approval. Macau has to go in that direction. But obviously, there are people that are saying that, well, there's the basic law, and the basic law enshrines the protection of personal property, and therefore, without 100% approval, no one can proceed with urban renewal, the tearing down of an old building, the building of a new building. Well, that is something for all of Macau to think about and decide. If we agree that it is a practical impossibility to get 100% approval, and there are reasons why it is not possible, because in some cases, some of the owners might have migrated, some of the owners might be deceased, and the property might be tied up in estate. And we've seen situations like that. Now, do we want urban renewal in Macau to be stopped because we do not have the foresight or the guts to make certain critical changes to the law or to our understanding of the law? My submission is that we need to do that. At the present moment, there are already a lot of buildings in Macau which are over 50 years old. And there will be more coming on stream because a lot of our buildings were built in the 70s and the 80s. And regardless of how well constructed they are, by a certain age, they become dangerous. Well, if we look at the past year and a half, what we see is that in 2015, there has been some declines. If we look at the first 4 or 5 months of 2016, there has been further declines. But then from May onwards, going into June, going into July, there has been clear signs of stabilization. In fact, prices for some sectors have started to move back up again. I think that is a result of two things. Number one, the economy in Macau is not bad at all. Of course, for those that are overseas, they will read headlines and they'll see gaming revenue dropping by 38%, government fiscal reserves dropping by over 50%. But don't forget, we are still in the top 10 when it comes to per capita GDP. We are still having our unemployment rate at 1.9%. And therefore, the citizens on the street are not at all suffering. Anyone that wants a job can have a job. The people that have suffered in the past year or so are basically, I think, junket operators, some of the owners and operators of F&B operations, jewelry shops, some high-end retail shops, etc. But people on the streets are ordinary citizens. Everyone is still holding on to at least one job. They can have 2 jobs if they want, and earning a very respectable salary. And when you have that sort of economic buffer, it's very difficult for property prices to go down. When you have rent control, several things happen. Number one, the landlord will choose his clients. If you extend that example to Macau, a landlord would prefer to rent his flat to Sands and not to a young person who's just starting in the world, getting his first job. And therefore, the real supply for local residents might actually shrink. You can't point a gun to the head of a landlord and say, look, please, rent your flat to this young man. He will choose someone who will be more prepared to consider a rental increase when the economy is going up, rather than to someone who would say that, hey, the law says you can't increase my rent. That is a reality we have to face. So number one, rent control, as it has shown in New York, in Toronto, in Vancouver, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Singapore, in China, will reduce the number of units available for rent to the local population, especially to young people. And that, I think, is one effect of rent control which I totally hate. That's number one. Number two, buildings will become dilapidated because when there is inflation, when the economy is going up, naturally rent, not just rent, but the price of a car, the price of a house, the price of a dinner, everything is going up with inflation. But you artificially kept rental at a certain level. So what does the landlord do? It will refuse to do repairs. It will refuse to do improvements. And that's why in areas where there's rent control, the buildings gradually become dilapidated to the extent that they become a safety issue. That is the second point that everyone needs to be aware of. The third point is, when a landlord knows that it cannot increase the rent further down the road, what would it do? It will ask for a higher starting rent. Again, that is not something you can legislate against. You can legislate against subsequent increases, but you cannot legislate against the beginning rent. I think what we need to do is to understand that if we really want diversification, then we need our local young talent to be adequately trained. And there is no better way to train them than to bring in foreign experts. Look at the case of Singapore again. Any company in Singapore, whether it's a local company or a foreign company, if they can bring in a local talent, which Macau needs, which Singapore needs, the government will issue a visa within 3 or 4 weeks. We have to do that because the reason why Singapore government does that is that they recognize the fact that the best way to train as young people is to have someone come in from the outside that have built up experience for 10 years or 20 years and impart that experience to the local people. We need to do that in Macau.